Okay. Let me remind you the course requirements. Unfortunately, most of you are not sending me the lab reports, the homeworks. I don't really know why, but only a couple of students are catching up with that. So I do not know what the problems, and I'm very open to help you if there is something I can do regarding that. If there is something unclear, if it's an issue of understanding or comprehension or things like that. But use even with the added week, I only got one more submission, so I'm a bit confused about that. So feel free to let me know if there are some issues. So according to my roster, my attendance list, I think there are I think close to 20 students. Asfau, can you mute yourself? There is a background noise coming from your side. But if I'm not mistaken, only 3 or 4 students are submitting those assignments. So I'm a bit concerned about that. So is there anyone who wants to tell me something about that? Am I missing something? What's happening? አሳይመንቶቹን እየላካችሁልኝ ስላልሆነ ግራ ገብቶኛል እያልኩኝ ነው። እና የሆነ ያልገባኝ ነገር ካለ ኦልሬዲ አሁን ሶስት ዊክ አለፈ ለብዙዎቻችሁ ሳትልኩልኝ። በዚህ ሳምንት የፖኤትሪ እና የዊዝደምን እንድትልኩ ነበር። ሌሰን 9.6 9.11 መላክ ነበረባችሁ።
እኔ ዛሬ ልኬያለሁ። ምናልባት አይተህ እንደሆነ አላወኩም።
ሳሙኤል አዎ ዛሬ ልከህልኛል። ልክ ነህ። አንተ ብቻ ነው የላከው ይህንን ሳምንት ተጠቅመው ከተጨመረ በኋላ እና ምንድነው ያልገባኝ ነገር ካለ ነው አለም አንተን ዝም ብሎ ግልጽ ያልሆነ ነገር ካለ ከኔ ሳይድ ለእንትን ላደርገው የምችለው ነገር ባውቅ ፈልጌ ነው እንጂ እያስጨነኳችሁ አይደለም። ኦፍ ኮርስ ግን if there is something I can do let me know እንድትሰሩ ስለሆነ የምፈልገው። ያልገባኝ ነገር ካለ please let me know. Okay, then let's talk about Gospels and Acts ዛሬ ወይም ደግሞ ኒው ቴስታመንት ናሬቲቭ ከዛ ደግሞ ኒው ቴስታመንት ኢፕስትልንም ከቻልን ከበር ለማድረግ እንሞክራለን። And just to recap, the assignments I'm talking about are those found in the workbook I assigned for you. You can find them in the shared drive. So please do consider submitting those in time. I want them to be a way of solidifying what we discuss in class. So I want you to submit them in time. So really the best way for you to learn and to solidify the theoretical aspect of exegesis and hermeneutics is for you to actually practice doing them. So if you talk about the Gospels and Acts today, it's quite important that you practice trying to exegete a gospel narrative or a gospel periocope immediately. So try and do that. The assignments really are not that demanding if you are feeling overwhelmed by them. They are a number of there are 3 or 4 questions and they are quite straightforward. They don't require you to consult any other secondary work. They don't require you to do any complex writing or thinking. They are simply glorified homeworks, really, and they only require 20 and 30 minutes of your time. So it's imperative that you assign at least that time That's that amount of time for your coursework. So I encourage you to do the rest. So each week's assignment has 4 points, I believe. So those of you who haven't submitted, so you have already lost close to 12 marks. So that's a lot. So it will also have repercussion on your grades as well, and your grade will suffer if you continue doing that. So do take that into consideration as well. Also, I hope you are working on your exegesis as well. Your exegesis will be due on the week after 29th of December. That is a week after we finish class. I believe that will be January 5. So do begin working on that. And if you send me your draft, I'm happy to give you feedback on that as well. I think 2 students have sent me their draft, and I have tried to give my feedback. So try and do that, and also the reading log. So I'm concerned that you're not reading the reading log as well, just from when I gather from the way you treated these assignments. I'm a bit concerned that you might not be reading the assigned readings as well. So be encouraged to read the readings as well. They are very important. They are the best way to learn. And time is the deadline for the reading log is going to be the 29th of December, and it will be a hard deadline. I won't be flexible on that. So please do start reading, and feel free to let me know if there are any issues, if there are any concerns that I can help with. Asafa, have you checked your email? I've emailed you back a while ago about arranging a virtual meeting, but you haven't gotten back to me. So check your email.
Actually, I checked and I just tried to respond twice. I don't know why it's not just it's put as a draft. I just tried 2 times, but I don't know the reason why. It might be my problem or the system. I don't know. I tried 2 times.
Oh, okay. Maybe it's an IT stuff. Maybe try to get technical help if there is available around you, or you can just send the email via Telegram. Just copy and paste it in my Telegram, and I will see it. Okay. So, what do you remember? What did we talk about 2 weeks ago? What was the issue of our last discussion? What do you remember? What do you remember? Yes, Asafa.
Okay, thank you very much. The thing that we discussed before 2 weeks was about interpreting this Hebrew pottery. That was the issue that we discussed. While we are just interpreting or dealing about Hebrew pottery, we are dealing with 2 important aspects: the issue of parallelism and the issue of stylistic device. And when we talk about parallelism, can be just defined as correspondence of one line with a subsequent line. I mean, the relationship between 2 lines in the pottery. And this is about, again, this parallelism can be talked in 3 ways, or we can talk it as synonymous. For example, synonymous parallelism, antithetic parallelism, and advancing parallelism. And when we talk about the issue of synonymous parallelism, or the issue of similarity, the similarity between the idea of 2 lines with different words but an equivalent voice. And when we talk about the issue of the antithetic parallelism, it is identified where parallel statements are placed in an opposite one another, or is a kind of comparison between two lines in the poetry. And the other one is the advancing parallelism, is the issue between, that means the second line advances or just adds meaning or maximize the first line. The issue of parallelism was just discussed. There are a lot of examples that have been raised concerning these issues from the book of Psalms and from Proverbs and the like. And the other thing that we discussed was about the issue of poetic devices, or the issue of stylistic devices. In addition to this parallelism, a prominent feature of this Hebrew poetry is the use of these issues, like, for example, the inclusio, or what we call inclusion. That means the idea of a certain poet is just repeated from the beginning and the end, or is a kind of bracketing. And the other thing that we saw was the simile or smiley, the kind of figurative device meant to compare a topic with an image. Is again is a kind of comparison. It compares an abstract image with certain issue or something. Abstract image is compared with something. And there is also a metaphor, which is another example of figurative speech or language meant to offer a comparison. Unlike, let's say, the simile that I said earlier, instead of just giving kind of meaning or just symbolizing, like, for example, God is my rock, something like that is a kind of metaphor. And there is a kind of what we call sindoke, is another type of figurative speech which is used as a substitution. In this figure of speech, the whole is represented by a part, or vice versa, or a particular is to refer to the whole, or the whole refers to the particular type. And again, the other one figurative speech that we discussed was hyperbole, which is a conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect, just exaggerating issues. There are also what we call personification, anthropomorphism, and zoomorphism. These issues were what we discussed and covered in our last time discussion, if I may not miss it.
Yes, you're right. That's a very good summary, Safa. Thank you. I believe we also talked about wisdom literature, right? Did we talk about wisdom literature?
I don't remember that one.
Okay.
If anyone else? I might have just missed it, but I don't remember it.
Sure. It's okay. I'm just checking. Mogas, have we talked about interpreting wisdom literature? Mogas, are you here? Or Samuel, do you remember?
What you have said?
Did we talk about interpreting wisdom literature?
I don't remember. The last time we have seen what Asafa has revised.
Okay. I was just checking. So, well, we might have to talk about that before going into the Gospels. Mskanu, do you remember? Can you help me? ዊዝደም የጥበብ መጽሐፍት እንዴት ነው መተርጎም ያለብን አይነት ነገር አውርተናል ወይስ ፖይትሪ ብቻ አውርተን አቆም?
አይ እሱን አላወረንም። ያን ቀን ፖትሪ ብቻ ያቆም ነው።
Okay. Then in that case, let's first talk about interpreting wisdom literature, and then we will talk about the Gospels today. ያረጀኝ ነው ማለት ነው። አያችሁ በሁለት ሳምንት ስለሆነ okay. So we'll talk about wisdom. So another genre of type Old Testament is what we call the wisdom genre type because it has its own context. It's usually important that we treat it as a unit, as a singular genre. So just to recap, do remember that we are still talking about exegesis, right? We are talking about exegesis. We first started by talking about hermeneutics, the scientific aspect of exegesis. We talked about some of the principles we should be aware of. We talked about the importance of the author, the importance of the reader, and we also talked about the importance of the text. And we identified that some methods that are characteristic of those certain groups, right? We talked about, for example, the historical critical method, like things like source criticism, reduction criticism, and we also talked about literary criticism, rhetorical criticism, and the likes. We also talked about reader-centered criticisms like feminist criticism or what we call autobiographical criticism. So we first started by establishing the theoretical aspect of it. Then we talked about 8 important steps, right? We said that those 8 exegetical steps, we talked about steps like defining words or word studies or investigating historical context or demarking an exegetical unit or establishing the text or doing a textual criticism of sorts. We said that those are foundational and those always apply. Whenever we think about exegesis, whenever we think about closely reading the biblical passage or studying the Bible, whether be it for personal studies or for an academic purpose or for a homiletical purpose, it's imperative that we try to follow those steps, right? It's always important to consider the historical context. It's always important to consider the literary context. It's always important to do word studies. It's always important to make sure that we are working with a stable text, that we perform it, that we form a sort of textual criticism, or doing a verse by verse analysis that is asking important question of each verses. So those steps are foundational, so they always applies. At the same time, we said that the Bible consists of different text types or different genres. Not everything is the same in the Bible, right? The literary convention, the literary method, the literary type is not always the same. So we are trying to nuance those 8 steps, or we are trying to add to those 8 steps foundational steps that helps us understand the biblical passage in light of the certain genre we are dealing with. So, for example, we said that when we talked about a certain genre that we labeled OT law, right? The OT commandments. So we discussed certain historical and theological considerations we should take into account when dealing with Old Testament law. And then we talked about OT narrative, right? And we talked about taking certain things into consideration when dealing with Old Testament narrative. We talked about the importance of identifying the setting, for example, or characters, or plot, things like that. So this doesn't mean that we pause or we forget the 8 steps, but in addition to 8 steps, we should also add these steps because of that specific genre. Each genre has its own constraints, its own rules, and its own way of communicating to us. So we are trying to appreciate those genres. So as Asfa summarized early on, we also talked about OT poetry. So poetry has its own genre, has its own rules, has its own styles. So it's important that we appreciate those specific features of it in addition to those foundational exegetical steps. So another genre we find in the Old Testament is what we call wisdom literature, or the wisdom genre, the wisdom tradition of ancient Israel. So the biblical wisdom literature comprises the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. So what we call the wisdom tradition of Israel in the canon. In the Old Testament canon, consists of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Songs of Songs is sometimes included in the list because it shows some affinity to wisdom literature, but it's more appropriate to treat it as a poetry rather than as a genre. But the Jews had other books that possess this genre. For example, in the Catholic and Orthodox canon, we find two books that are called Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach or Ecclesiastes. So those books are also written in this genre, or those books are also part of the wisdom tradition of Israel. So one specific thing about these books, or one specific characteristics of these books or these traditions, that the biblical material or the wisdom tradition is especially focused on the life of the individual. It's focused on the life concern of the individual. It's a very personalized genre. So it's about the individual. It's about everyday life, and it's very practical. It's a very applied theology kind of work. So think of, for example, important cultural motives like the temple or the king, for that matter, or the land, the promised land, or eschatological hope, or things like that. Those themes that we find very important in other kind of literatures, in narrative, in poetry, they are oddly absent from wisdom tradition. Wisdom tradition is not that interested about the temple, for example. It's not interested about eschatology. It's not interested about the exile. It's not interested about the priesthood and things like that. Its sole focus, in a way, is not that religious. It really is about the practical aspect of life. So wisdom literature is quite unique in that direction. So it, for example, doesn't even mention the Torah. Can you imagine that a Jewish book that doesn't talk about the Torah? So wisdom tradition, at least as far as we find it in the canon, that we don't see it being concerned about these things. It doesn't even mention the Torah. It doesn't, for example, talk about the temple cult. It doesn't talk about the sacrificial rituals or the priesthood or things like that. Rather, it's very focused. It's singularly focused on the life of the individual, on everyday life. It really tries to answer the question of how should one live or how should one act. So, for the most part, the wisdom tradition of Israel developed in relation to the wisdom tradition of the Greeks. So, in a way, the reason for the reason that these things are absent is that it really is a response to the Greek obsession of finding a way of life or talking about a way of life, things like that. So that's why it's in a way they are producing their own answer to those questions. So not only geographical and motives like the temple or things like that, but even the important historical events like the Exodus or the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and things like that are not also mentioned in the canonical wisdom literature, but we can find some exceptions in the non-canonical wisdom literature. It's not even concerned about the nation as a whole. It doesn't really show a national agenda. As I've said, it's concerned about the individual. Specifically, it seems to be concerned about the life of a young man from Israel. So the reason for this is that the setting of this genre might be the synagogue or the school in a way, because for the most part, young boys were the only one who would go and learn, who would go and study the Torah and things like that. So wisdom tradition the setting might be that educational setting. So its concern is about a certain young person, right? If you think about wisdom literature, the advice being given to a young man. So it's about a young man. So the concern is, how should a young man act? How should a young boy act? So the setting might be an educational setting. So, for example, think of advices against a strange woman, right? Against a beautiful woman, or against lust and things like that. They are solely concerned about the concern of a young man. So the primary audience might have been male audience. This, of course, doesn't mean that this doesn't transport to female audience, but the main concern seems to be the male audience, and this might tell us about the setting of the genre itself ማለት ነው. So how should we interpret it? The first thing to remember is that even though the wisdom tradition is not that concerned about theological discourses, it consistently tells us about the importance of the fear of Yahweh. So all wisdom tradition seems to revolve around this. So የጥበብ መጀመሪያ እግዚአብሔርን መፍራት ነው የሚለው ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ so even though the book goes on to talk about the practical aspect of life, it in a way seems to be rooting this practical aspect in the theological conviction that all knowledge, all wisdom, all way of life should be rooted in the fear of Yahweh. So the theological underpinning of these practical advices, this practical aspect of life seems to be the idea that the fear of Yahweh should underpin everything. So in a way, the wisdom tradition is trying to tell us the practical aspect of actually fearing Yahweh. So it tells us that wisdom is to actually fear Yahweh. It actually is to revere Yahweh. And then it goes on to tell us how that should materialize. So the fear of Yahweh in wisdom tradition is not psychological, solely psychological or heart. Rather, it's something we live out to. So it tells us that the beginning of it, the start of everything, the foundation for everything, is the fear of Yahweh. And it gives us advice. To fear Yahweh actually is to live accordingly, is to live in a wise manner of the sage. So there is this theological underpinning. So we shouldn't forget that everything is rooted in the fear of Yahweh. And just like any other genre, it's also important to consider the context of wisdom tradition, at least in some sense. So it's not always important. It's not a very context-dependent book. The wisdom tradition oftentimes is a collection of proverbs, mini proverbs that seem to stand on their own terms. But for example, if you consider the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 1 to 9, and then 13 and 30 to 31 seems to be bound up together. So it's always good to consider the wider context if there's something like that. So we should also consider that. And if you consider, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes, context really matters. Ecclesiastes, the only way Ecclesiastes makes sense, መክብብ ሴንስ ሊሰጥ የሚችለው is if we start it from the start to the end, and if we take everything into consideration. So just simply taking a certain verse out of Ecclesiastes will lead us to wrong conclusions. So the power of Ecclesiastes is to be found in the summation of the whole book. So it's always good to consider context. However, it's really important to remember that Proverbs are the foundational part of wisdom literature, especially as we find it in the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs are short, poetic aphorisms. So they are poetic. This means they follow the rules of poetry, right? They are parallel. They use stylistic devices. So remember that Proverbs, these short proverbs that we find scattered in the book of Proverbs, they are essentially poetic. They are poetry. They are mini poetry. So everything we talked about poetry applies ማለት ነው. At the same time, it's really important to remember that Proverbs or wisdom tradition is a book of advices. It's an advice. It's not a solid doctrinal preposition or things like that. The book of Proverbs, they are general principles, they are advices, and they are contextual. So they are not promises, or they are not timeless principles. So we should remember that the wisdom tradition, as we already said, is concerned about the practical aspect of life. They are concerned about the practical aspect of a young man's life. So their concern is solely, primarily, on giving advice. So they are giving advice. So advices, they by their nature are generic, right? So we have to remember that they are generic and they are not always true. The advices of Proverbs or books like Ecclesiastes, they are not always true. They are not meant to be always true. Rather, they are given us advice. So, for example, consider yourself giving advice, for example, for your young boy. So you might advise him to study, and you might promise him that if he studies, he will succeed, or he will get everything in life, and he will have a happy life. But that advice doesn't mean that it's always true, right? It doesn't mean that everyone who studies will ultimately have a happy life or a successful life. No. Advices are generally true. They are true. They are generally true, but it doesn't mean they are always true. So we have to remember that whenever we find whenever we read wisdom literature, Proverbs, we should understand that they are not always true. Rather, they are given as advice. They are generally true. So considering every other thing is equal, considering every other variable is equal, these advices will be true. But they are variable, they are open for external circumstances. So we find this in the book of Proverbs itself, for example. Consider, for example, Proverbs 26, verse 4. Proverbs 26, verse 4, it reads, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." Right? So ሰነፍን እንደ ስንፍናው አትመልስለት፣ ከመለስክለት አንተ ራሱ እንደሱ ትሆናለህ ይላል። Okay? So what does this mean? Does it mean that we should always keep silent? That we shouldn't answer to a fool? That we should always be silent? Is that the main point? That's not the main point, right? The point that's being communicated is that sometimes engaging with a foolish argument will lower you to his level, and it's really unproductive. So sometimes sometimes it's important to be quiet. But right at the next verse, Proverbs says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." So the next verse goes on to say that we should actually answer a fool according to his folly. Otherwise, ያወቀ ይመስለዋል። ስለዚህ ለሰነፍ አትመልስለት ካለ በኋላ ቀጣይ ቁጥር ላይ ደግሞ ለሰነፍ መልስለት ይላል። So the author is giving us clue, right? Each advice doesn't mean it always applies. Rather, they are contextual. It depends on the context. So it depends on the context. So at other times, it is necessary to correct a fool to prevent them from thinking they are right, and to help them, to guide them back to the truth ማለት ነው። Hence, these are advice, right? Advices, they work according to the context. So this doesn't mean that the Bible is contradictory. Rather, we should appreciate the genre. We should remember that wisdom tradition is giving us advice. So the advice being communicated here is that sometimes it's important to be quiet, and sometimes it's important to speak up. Hence, the call is yours. Depending on the context, you will follow the appropriate commandment ማለት ነው። Hence, it would be wrong, for example, if we treat the first verse as dogmatic and as always true, right? We'll be quiet and we will always take abuse, and it will also be wrong if we follow the next verse as always true, right? That would make us mere talkers and mere debaters. Hence, we need to appreciate that wisdom tradition is contextual. ምክር ነው የሚሰጡን። ስለዚህ ያንን ምክር እንደ ኮንቴክስቱ አፕላይ እናደርገዋለን ማለት ነው እንጂ ሁሌ ይሰራል ማለት አይደለም። ምክር ባይስ ኔቸር ሁሌ አይሰራም አይደል? ስለዚህ እሱን ማስታወስ አለብን ማለት ነው ዊዝደም ሊትሬቸርን ስናነብ። You can also take this example. For example, Proverbs 10, it says, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. ስለዚህ ሰነፍ የሆኑ እጆች ናቸው ድህነትን የሚያመጡት እያለ ነው። ትጉ የሆኑ እጆች ግን ሀብትን ያገኛሉ ይላል። So according to these proverbs, the reason for poverty is lazy hands, and the reason for wealth is diligence, is ትጋት. But clearly this is not always true, right? And the Proverbs 23, for example, gives us something that sounds opposite to this. For example, it says, do not wear yourself out to get rich. ለሀብት ብላችሁ አትድከሙ ደግሞ ይለናል። So which one is true? ትጋት ሀብትን የሚያመጣው ከሆነ ለምን አትድከሙ ይለናል። So this is advice again. Remember that this is advice. So you take it depending on the context. For example, for a person who is being tempted with laziness, በስንፍና እየተፈተነ ላለው, you would advise him Proverbs 10, right? ስንፍና ድህነትን ያመጣል ብላችሁ ታበረታቱታላችሁ። እንዴት ስንፍናውን እንዲረሳ ማለት ነው። በት ደግሞ አለቅጥ ደግሞ ሀብትን ለማግኘት በሚል ራሱን እያደከመ ሌሎች ነገሮችን እየረሳ ላለ ሰው ደግሞ እንደሱ አይደለም፣ ሀብትም ደግሞ ትሉታላችሁ። Hence, you should understand that these are advices and they have their own context. So they are not always true. Advice by itself is not always true. They are generally true. So generally speaking, በጠቅላላው በደምሳሳው ስናወራ ስንፍና ድህነትን ያመጣል። በደምሳሳው ስናወራ ትጋት ሀብትን ያመጣል። This doesn't mean it's always the case, right? This doesn't mean that it's always the case. We are talking generally, right? Generally. So ቅድም እንዳልኳችሁ ታናሽ ልጆቻችሁን ስትመክሯቸው አጥኑ፣ ካጠናችሁ የፈለጋችሁትን ትሆናላችሁ ትላችኋላችሁ። But you are assuming every other thing being equal, right? ሁሉ ነገር እኩል ከሆነ ሁሉ ነገር እንዳሰባችሁት ከሆነ ነው እንጂ means that ካጠኑ የፈለጉትን ያገኛሉ ማለት አይደለም። Advices are generally true. They are generally true, but they are not always true. So Proverbs ላይ የምናገኛቸውን አድቫይሶች እንደዚህ ነው ማየት ያለብን። ይሄ በናሬቲቭ መልኩም ፕሬዘንት ይደረግልናል። For example, one theme, ስለዚህ አሁን እዚህ ጋር እንዳየነው one theme that we find repeated in the Old Testament is this motive of retribution, right? ጻድቃን ይለመልማሉ፣ ድሆች ግን ይጠፋሉ። ሀጣን ግን ይጠፋሉ፣ ድሆች ይሆናሉ። ጻድቃን ሀብትን ያገኛሉ። እንደዚህ የሚሉ ፕሪንሲፕሎችን እናገኛለን። ጻድቃንን እግዚአብሔር ይባርካቸዋል። እንደዚህ አይነት ነገር። So sometimes certain teachers use these verses to abuse their victims, right? They abuse these verses to say that righteousness and wealth are, for example, directly related or things like that. But that's not the idea being communicated. The idea being communicated is that generally, God will bless your toil. ድካማችሁን እግዚአብሔር ይባርክላችኋል, generally speaking. But this doesn't mean that that's always the case. This doesn't mean that, for example, በምድር ያለ መከራ ሊያጋጥማችሁ ይችላል፣ ሊበተኑ ይችላሉ፣ ደግሞ ላታገኙ ትችላላችሁ። So we shouldn't treat Proverbs as promises or as dogmatic prepositions. Rather, we should see them as advices that are generally true. So you should be cautious when you study the book of Proverbs or wisdom tradition as a whole, and be careful when you are preaching from them in order not to make wrong points ማለት ነው። The best example for this, for example, we see this retributive principle being frequently mentioned in wisdom tradition, but at the same time we find it being subverted, for example, in books like the book of Job, right? So in a way, the book of Job is part of the wisdom tradition of Israel, and we see that even though Job is a righteous man, we find him being tempted and we find him being suffering. So the idea that righteousness and wealth, for example, or righteousness and well-being is directly related is clearly not always true, and that's what the author actually is trying to tell us. The friends of Job, they assume the retributive principle. They assume that the reason for his suffering surely has to be that he has sinned in a way. But it turned out that the reason for his suffering actually is he's God himself. All those things happen precisely because he is a righteous person. So we should treat them as generally true, but we shouldn't treat them as always true. So this is the interpretive principle that you should remember for wisdom genre. In addition to the foundational exegetical steps we've already discussed. Good. Is it clear what I've said so far? Any questions? Anything that needs to be clarified? So this is the wisdom tradition of Israel. We actually find some resemblance in the New Testament as well, right? Some New Testament documents do reflect this wisdom tradition. Sometimes in Christology, right? There is a thing called wisdom Christology in the New Testament. For example, the Johannine Logos and the Son in Hebrew 1. They do show some affinity to the wisdom tradition of Israel, and the Book of James also shows some quality of this wisdom tradition. Okay. Should we continue to interpreting the Gospels? Yes, Asafa.
Thank you very much. Really very clear explanation on the idea of proverb. I mean the issue, the wisdom literature that we're talking about. Before just pass to the next, let me just raise some issues. One of the issues that I want to raise is about the issue of this assignment. Actually, the assignment that has been just given is, as to me, is very logical, because the assignments has been just designed ahead of time, and we have been just given to do it after we discussed each topic. Concerning, in my case, concerning the last assignment, the third assignment, I was just expecting to discuss, because I was just thinking that the assignment is to be submitted after the discussion of the topic. Therefore, I didn't submit the third assignment because I thought that we didn't discuss the topic on that issue. That I want you just to consider that. The other thing,
Sure, fair enough.
yeah,
you can send it. You can send it in this week.
Okay, thank you very much. The other thing that I want to just ask, or to tell, to say a few things on the following words before we just proceed to the next, because when I just read these points, I've been just a little bit confused. If you like, just you may give us just an example in Amharic, like these words, like for example, the author, implied author, narrator on the side of the author, and the side of the reader, the implied reader, and the narratee. These three words, I mean, on the side of the author and on the side of the reader, these three words are just confusing me. Please, just with few examples, with few minutes, just try to explain me for some few minutes. Sorry.
Okay. So የሊትራሪ ክሪቲሲዝም ቋንቋዎች ናቸው እነሱ። ምን መሰላችሁ ልዩነቱ? when you think of an author, you think of the person who actually writes the product you're reading, right? ስለዚህ የምታነቡትን ነገር የሚጽፈውን ሰው ኦተር እንለዋለን። ስለዚህ ዘ አክቹዋል ጸሐፊ ማለት ነው። የኦተር ሴንተርድ የሆነ ቋንቋ ላይ ጸሐፊውን ሪፕሬዘንት ለማድረግ እናደርጋለን። ስለዚህ እሱን ለማግኘት እንሞክራለን ማለት ነው። የጽሁፉ ሪል ኦተር ላይሆን ይችላል። ራዘር ሪል ኦተሩ እንደ ጻፈው እንድናስበው የሚፈልገው ሰው ሊሆን ይችላል። ምን ማለት ነው? ለምሳሌ ዝም ብሎ በጣም ኤሌመንታሪ በሆነ ምሳሌ እኔ እየጻፍኩኝ የሆነ ነገር ግን እኔ ስጽፍ ለምሳሌ አንድ ሴት እንደጻፈችው እንድታስቡ ከፈለኩኝ እና በዛ መልኩ ከጻፍኩኝ ስለዚህ አይ አም ዘ ሪል ኦተር ግን ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር ግን ሌላ ናት ማለት ነው አይደል? ኦተሩን የሚያነብ ሊያገኝ የሚችለው ምስል የሆነች ሴት እንደጻፈችው ነው። ስለዚህ ኢን ሪያሊቲ ግን ኦተሩ ሌላ ነው። ስለዚህ ዜር ኢዝ አ ዲፍረንስ ቢትዊን ዘ ኦተር ኤንድ ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ቴክስት ሴንተርድ የሆኑ አፕሮቾችን ስንከተል እና የሚከተሉ ሰዎች ኦተር ከማለት ይልቅ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር ይላሉ። ምክንያቱም ስለ ኦተሩ የሚያውቁትን ነገር ከቴክስቱ ብቻ ስለሆነ የሚወስኑት ኦተሩን ይሄን የተጻፈውን ነገር ስናነብ ስለ ኦተሩ ኮንስትራክት ልናደርገው የምንችለውን ነገር ተጠቅሞ ኮንስትራክት የሚያደርጉትን ቢንግ ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር ይሉታል ማለት ነው። ይህንን ስናነብ ጸሐፊው እንዲህ ይመስላል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ዜር ኢዝ አ ዲፍረንስ ቢትዊን ኦተር ኤንድ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር it's quite related with the method you're following ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ኦተር ሴንተርድ የሆኑ አፕሮቾችን የሚከተሉ ሂስቶሪካል ክሪቲካል ሜተድን ስንከተል አወር አቴምፕትስ ዘ ሪል ኦተርን ለማግኘት እሱን ሪኮንስትራክት ለማድረግ አይደለ? እንደዛ ነው። ቴክስት ሴንተርድ አፕሮች ግን ሰው ሲከተል they are not that concerned about the real author or ጻፈው ነገር ስለ ኦተሩ ልናውቅ የምንችለው ነገር ላይ ብቻ ኮንሰርንድ ይሆናሉ ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እሱን ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ኦተር ይሉታል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደር ሲሆንም ደግሞ ዘሴም ሀፕን ያደርጋል ማለት ነው። ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደር ሪል ሪደር ላይሆን ይችላል። ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደር አሁን እያነበበው ያለው ሰው ላይሆን ይችላል። ራዘር ጸሐፊው ሲጽፍ አስቦ የጻፈለት ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደር ማለት እንዲያነበው የታሰበው አይዲያል የሆነውን ሪደር ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደር እንለዋለን ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ አንድን ደብዳቤ ለምሳሌ እነከሌ አባበሉ እንዲያነቡት ብዬ ከጻፍኩኝ እነከሌ እናበቡ ዘ ኢምፕላይድ ሪደርስ ናቸው። ግን ያ ደብዳቤ እየዞረ ሰው ሁሉ ሊያነበው ይችላል። ስለዚህ እነሱ ግን they are not the real readers ማለት ነው። they are the real readers ግን they are not the implied readers። ስለዚህ the implied reader the intended የሆነው the implied author intend ያደረገው ጸሐፊ እንዲያነበው መጀመሪያ ያሰበውን ጸሐፊ the implied reader ብለው ይሰይሙታል ማለት ነው። ቴክስት ሴንተርድ የሚከተሉ ሰዎች ዘናሬተር እና ዘናሬቲቭ ተመሳሳይ ነው። ናሬተሩ ያው ናሬት የሚደረግ ነገር ናሬት የሚያደርገው ማለት ነው። ፖይንት ኦፍ ቪውን ስንፈልግ የናሬተሩን ፖይንት ኦፍ ቪው ነው የምንፈልገው እንደምንለው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ናሬተሩ ነው ሁሉንም የሚያውቅ ሊሆን ይችላል። ያ ናሬተር በየቦታው የሚሄድ የሚመጣ፣ ስለዚህ ቴክስት ውስጥ ነው ያለው። ከቴክስቱ ውጭ ኤግዚስት አያደርግም ዘናሬተር። ዘናሬቲቭ ዘኢምፕላይድ ሪደር ነው ናሬት የሚደረግለት ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ እነዚህ የእንትኖች ቋንቋ ናቸው፣ የሜተድ ቋንቋ ናቸው። አድቫንስድ ሄርሜኒውቲክስ ስትማሩ በደንብ ከቨር ታደርጓቸዋላችሁ።
Thank you very much.
It's okay. Okay, let's talk about interpreting the Gospels. So the Gospels, they are narrative. They are New Testament narrative. So we only speak about certain things, and you can pretty much apply what we discussed when we talked about interpreting Old Testament narrative here as well. The essential aspect is the same since they are narrative as well. So the Gospels, even though we treat them as genre, as certain text type now, they were not designed to be text type, right? When the Gospel writers began writing the Gospels, they didn't set out to write a gospel. They didn't say let's write a gospel, right? They didn't have a genre called gospel. Rather, the Gospels seem to have evolved as a genre in the second and third century, when Christians tried to mimic the four Gospels, and when they began producing their own Gospels. So, as you know, in the second and third century, the Christians wrote hundreds of works with the name Gospel attached to them. So, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of James, things like that. So during that time, the Gospels as a genre seems to have been recognized and seems to have been studied in that category. But for the original Gospel writers, there was no such thing as a Gospel genre. So the word Gospel itself, it means Evangelion, as you know. It simply means good news, something important, an important news. So you could use the word, for example, to talk about a news of victory. For example, if your country conquered certain victory, you would call that a gospel. Or an ascension of an emperor could be called a gospel. So the idea is that it's a proclamation of something important, something major, something joyful, something great. So, for example, Paul, whenever he uses the word gospel, he uses it in this context. He doesn't use it as a genre or as a text type. So it's a message. It's a great message. It's an important message. It's a joyful message about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So, as I've said, the Gospels as a genre seems to have been developed after the circulation of the four Gospels. So when the Gospel writers, however, were writing, they didn't intend to pioneer a genre as well. They rather were using the genres that were available to them back then. So when thinking about the Gospels, it's important to take into consideration three text types that were quite common in the Greco-Roman world, especially as it related to history. The first one is what we call acts. So in Greco-Roman culture, in Greco-Roman literary culture, there was a certain genre called acts or praxis. So for example, the Acts of the Apostle is a good example. The Acts of the Apostle seems to have been written as a praxis, as an act, as the genre it follows is praxis. So this genre is focused on actions. It's about action. It's about movement. The concern is about what's being accomplished, what's being done. The question it tries to answer is what's happening, what's being done, and things like that. So Acts is a very action-oriented genre. So think of Acts of the Apostle, for example. The concern of the Acts of the Apostle is to tell you what's happening, right? So even though, for example, it talks about the biblical figures like Paul, like Peter, the concern is not to give you a profile of them, or it's not trying to develop their character and things like that. The primary concern is to tell you what's happening, what's going on, and what the Holy Spirit is doing through these people. So the concern is not the apostles themselves, rather it's their acts, it's their action. So another genre is what we call memoirs. Memoirs is a saying genre. It's about what a certain individual said or taught or things like that. So it's concerned about what's being said, about what's being communicated. So there were some works that follow this genre as well. And the third one is what we call lives or bio. So we get our word biography from this genre. Bio is focused on the character, on the subject himself. It's concerned about the character of the subject you are writing about. So it might mention his acts, what that person does, or it might also mention what that person said or taught, things like that. But its primary concern is about giving you an image of sorts about the subject, about that character. So it's a very character-focused genre. It's a very subject-focused genre. So the gospel writers seems to have been following this genre. So we can, in a way, see the gospels as a combination of these three genres, because the three aspects are available, but the primary genre that seems to have dominated is what we call bios or lives. So the Gospels are focused on the life of Jesus. They are about Christ. Even though they talk about his action, about his miracles, and about his teachings, they are concerned about his person, about his character. They want to give us an image, a mosaic of sorts about Jesus ማለት ነው. Hence, they are very subject oriented. They are very character oriented. So even when you talk about the actions of Jesus, about the teaching of Jesus, you should also remember that you are reading a biography, an ancient biography, and that those teachings, those actions are there to illustrate a point about the character of Christ himself. Hence, you should take this into consideration when dealing with the Gospels. Okay, they are written to say something about the character of Jesus. Hence, this is also the academic consensus, even though there are some varieties about the specific of it. Most scholars agree that the Gospels are biographical. They are ancient biographies. So there is theology associated with them. So some prefer to call them theological biography, some to treat them as drama and things like that. But still, the biographical aspect of it is quite accepted in academic circles as well. So the implication of them being a biography is that being them an ancient biography is that we shouldn't treat them as modern biographies. Okay, when we read modern biographies, we, for example, expect them to be chronological, right? We expect them to be chronological. We expect them to be exhaustive. For example, almost all modern biographies that we read start by telling us something about the parents of the character that we are reading about, and then they proceed to telling us about the childhood of the person we're reading about, and it will add up chronologically to the climax of the story. But ancient biographies didn't work in that way. They were not chronological, and they didn't feel the need to be exhaustive. Rather, they were selective, and they were selective of the material that they believed shed the best light about the character of the subject. As I've already said, biographies are concerned about shedding light about the subject of the character, about the character, about his nobleness or his behavior or things like that. And the biography writers, selected events, things that highlighted the certain aspects they are trying to help us see. So, for example, Plutarch, he's one of the best-known biographers of the ancient world. He writes that when he talks about in his introduction to his biography on Alexander the Great, he says, "I am not a writer of histories, but of biographies." So he clearly is differentiating between history and biography, right? So my readers, therefore, must excuse me if I do not record all events or describe them in detail. So in a way, he's saying, since I'm not writing history and since I'm writing biography, I'm not obliged to be as detailed as needed, right? I have the freedom to be generalized, to be selective, and I will only briefly touch upon the noblest and the most famous. You see, he's saying that since I'm writing biography, I have the freedom to be selective, and I have the freedom. And he takes the imagery of painting, and as painters produce a likeness by the representation of the countenance, of the expression of the face, in which the character is revealed without troubling themselves about the other parts of the body. So he's saying that biography allows you to be selective of events and time periods that helps you show the glimpse of that character as clearly as possible ማለት ነው. So if you are interested about biographies and about the Gospels as biographies, you should check out a book by Richard Burridge that's entitled What Are the Gospels? And it's a very good book. So this has implication. This has implication for interpreting them and for understanding them as well. The first thing is that you shouldn't read them like modern biographies. Okay, you shouldn't read the Gospels as modern biographies. They must be read on their own terms as ancient biographies. And we should also remember that they didn't have the obligation to cover everything. Rather, they have the freedom to be selective, and they have the freedom to interpret the subject as they saw fit. So this is, for example, the way we can explain, for example, some of the diversity we find in Mark, in Matthew, and Luke. Since they were writing biographies, the authors had freedom to be interpretive in a way, to be theologically inclined as well. And for example, the reason we find some mismatch in chronology is because the ancient biographies, for whatever reason, they were not concerned about chronological order. Hence, they felt free, for example, to rearrange events. So that's why, for example, if you compare, for example, the Gospel of John with the Synoptic Gospels, we see that the cleansing of the temple in the Gospel of John is placed at the beginning, but it's placed at the end in the Synoptic Gospels. So this makes sense if you read them in light of the fact that they are ancient biographies and so authors had freedom to be flexible chronologically. So this is one thing to remember. Other than that, I also want to remind you that the Gospels are essentially stories. Since they are stories, everything we talked about, narrative applies to them as well. So when reading the Gospels, you should remember that you are reading narrative. Hence, you should ask questions like characters. You should ask questions like plot and plot development and things like point of view and everything we talked about, a narrative applies to the Gospels as well. So you can read the Gospels. You can read the Gospels and you the whole when you think the story, what things complicate. So you can ask things like questions like narrative techniques that we discussed as a whole. Hence, you should treat the Gospels. You should treat the Gospels as a whole, and as as stories. Good. Any questions regarding this? What we've said so far? As a case study, let's talk about interpreting the parables. As you know, Jesus is known for teaching with parables, right? In the Synoptic Gospels, especially the preferred method of communicating for Jesus is parables. So the word parable is a Greek word. It means something like comparison, and the word misali in Amharic is actually quite great translation. So, depending on the book you're reading, you might find from up to 30 to 80 parables. So some scholars prefer to treat every metaphor, every simile as parable, but some only treat the narrative parables or the more complex parables as parables, and they count as much as 30 parables in the mouth of Jesus. So even in antiquity, Jesus is well known for using parables to communicate his message. So parables really are important for Jesus, and understanding parables is quite important to understand what actually Jesus taught. So based on their form, parables can be categorized into three. The first one are the short ones that are aphorisms. They are short statements that consist of classic truths. So, for example, when Jesus says, "A blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit?" In a way, this is aphorisms. They are classical truths. Hence, we can count them as parables, and some do. And he also uses similes. For example, he compares, for example, the kingdom of God with some abstract thing, with some concrete things, right? The kingdom of God is like a seed or something like that. So those are similes, and we can treat them as parables in a way. But there are what we call the narrative parables. Another category is what we call narrative parables. And these parables are complex relatively, and they are essentially stories. For example, think of the parable of the sower, think of the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the Samaritan, and things like that. Hence, Jesus chose to teach using parables. Since it's important to understand parables, right? In a way, they are our access to the historical Jesus in a way. So this does mean, of course, that the parables are not found elsewhere. They are actually found in the Old Testament as well, and they are also found in Second Temple Jewish literature as well. For example, think of 2 Samuel 12, where the prophet Nathan exhorts David, right? He tells him a parable, right? So he tells him a parable, and ሀብታም ሰው ነበረ፣ ብዙ በጎች ነበሩ ሲለው he is telling him a parable. Hence, his primary teaching method for Jesus was a parable. In antiquity, no one else used parables as much as Jesus used. So how should we interpret parables? For much of history, allegorical interpretation of the parables has been the preferred method. So some patristic fathers opted to employ allegorical interpretation in order to understand parables. For example, consider Augustine's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. I believe we've seen this when we talk about history as well. So, for example, in the Good Samaritan story, for Augustine, the man represented Adam, and going down from Jerusalem. Jerusalem represented the city of heavenly peace, and to fail among the robbers meant to fail among the devils. So, who left him half dead alone, it means spiritual death and things like that. So, the church, in a way, opted to interpret the parables allegorically. In a way, this way of interpreting them, in a way, was inherited from Jesus himself, right? So, Jesus actually interprets two parables for us in the Gospels, and he seems to have employed allegorical interpretation, right? For example, think of the interpretation of the sower, የዘሪው ምሳሌ, the parable of the sower. So in a way, he seems to have been employing allegorical interpretation, at least to some extent. We can argue that that's an analogical, but in a way, it's an allegorical interpretation. ዘሩ ከላይ ነው፣ ዘሪው እንደዚህ ነው፣ ሾሁ እንደዚህ ነው ሲል, in a way, he seems to be using allegory, hence taking their cue from Jesus. The church fathers seems to have been using allegorical interpretation in order to understand parables. But in the 19th century, there was a reaction against this way of reading the parables. A German scholar, he wrote actually 2 volumes on the parables, only on the parables, if you can believe them, and he argues for a one message parables. He said that we should focus on the parables as a unit and try to find their singular meaning rather than focusing on each element of the parables and trying to allegorize. We should focus on treating the parables as a whole and finding their unified meaning. So he argued for a one message parables, that is. So also he offered a very necessary corrective. His approach in a way should be taken with a grain of salt, because, as you've said, Jesus himself seems to have been using that interpretation to some extent, but it can be argued that even Jesus' allegorical interpretation at the end of the day has a singular message. So how should we interpret parables? The first is to find the points of reference. That is to identify the characters, the main characters, and to find irony. That is, the parables hugely rely on irony in order to make their point, and to identify the audience, and as everything else, to consider the context of the parables. So we will see an example to make this clear. So don't worry about this. For example, think of the parable of the prodigal son. Think of the parable of the prodigal son. So we find it in Luke 15. First, you should ask what we can get from the immediate context. The first step is to identify the audience. Parables, they have their own audience, okay? Some parables are spoken to the disciples in a private setting. Some are given to the crowd as a whole. Some are given to what are labeled as the sinners or the tax collectors, and some are given to the scribes and the Pharisees. Hence, you should ask whom is this parable being told? Who is the audience of the primary audience of this parable? Because identifying that audience helps you identify the intended audience, the primary audience. So, for example, if you can open Luke 15 in your phones, and can you identify the parable? Can you identify the audience? Who do you think is the audience? Luke 15. Who do you think is the audience of that parable? Okay, who is here? Let me see. Okay, Aser, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Aser, can you open your Bible to Luke 15 and read for us verse 1 and verse 2?
Okay. Okay, in KGB.
Sure, in whatever version you choose.
Chapter 15, 1 and 2, verse 1 and 2. Then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, this man receive sinners and is with them. This.
Yes. So ምዕራፍ 15 ሲጀምር አንድ ቀን ቀረጥ ሰብሳቢዎችና ኃጢአተኞች ሁሉ ሊሰሙት በዙሪያው ተሰበሰቡ ይለናል። ከዛ ፈሪሳውያንና ጸሐፍትም ይህ ሰው ኃጢአተኞችን ይቀበላል፣ ከእነርሱ ጋርም ይበላል እያሉ አጉረመረሙ። Hence, we find the audience here ማለት ነው። We have two set of audiences pretty much. The first one are the Pharisees, the publicans, ግብዞች የተባሉት ናቸው። ከዛ በኋላ ደግሞ ኃጢአተኞችም እንዳሉ ኃጢአተኞች የተባሉ ቀረጥ ሰብሳቢዎች የተባሉ እናያለን። ሂንስ ይሄ ፓራብል ሲናገር ለእነዚህ ሰዎች ፕራይመሪ የተነገረ ነው ማለት ነው ቻፕተር 15 ላይ። and then what triggered sub parable? ፓራብሉን ስንናገር ኢየሱስ ምን አደረገው? ለምን ተናገረ ብሎ መጠየቅ ደግሞ ጥሩ ነው። ፓራብልን ኢንተርፕሬት ለማድረግ ከሞከር ጀምሮ ምክንያቱን እዚህ ጋር እናገኘዋለን። ቁጥር 2 ላይ ፈሪሳውያንና ጸሐፍት ይህ ሰው ኃጢአተኞችን ይቀበላል ከእነርሱም ጋር ይበላል እያሉ አጉረመረሙ። ሂንስ ከዛ ቁጥር 3 ጋር ነው ኢየሱስም እንዲህ ሲል ይህን ምሳሌ ነገራቸው ብሎ የምሳሌዎች ዝርዝር የምናገኘው የፓራብል ዝርዝር። ሂንስ the reason or the trigger that made Jesus tell this parable is the murmuring of these Pharisees and ላጉረመረሙ ነው የተነገረው ይሄ ምሳሌ ማለት ነው። ሂንስ in a way ለማጉረምረማቸው ምሳሌ መልስ መሆን አለበት። at the end of the parable the meaning of the parable should address this murmuring ማለት ነው። ከዛ በኋላ ቁጥር 11 ላይ የጠፋው ልጅ ምሳሌ ጋር ከመድረሳችን በፊት ከሱ በፊት ሁለት ምሳሌዎች ይናገራሉ። መጀመሪያ ላይ አንድ ሰው 100 በጎች እንዳሉት ይነግረናል። ከዛ በኋላ he loses one sheep። ከዛ በኋላ the scripture tells us how he left the 99 and go on trying to find that lost one። ከዛ በኋላ ካገኙ በኋላ ሃይላይት የሚደረግልን ምንድነው? የጠፋውን በጌን አግኝቻለሁና ከኔ ጋር ደስ ይበላችሁ ይላል ጎረቤቶቹን ሰብስቦ። ስለዚህ የጠፋው ስለተገኘ ደስ አለው። ከዛ እላችኋለሁ እንደዚሁም ንስሐ ከማያስፈልገው ከ99 ጻድቃን ይልቅ ንስሐ በሚገባ በአንድ ኃጢአተኛ በሰማይ ደስታ ይሆናል ይላችኋል። ሂንስ ይህን ምሳሌ የተናገረው የጠፋ ነገር ሲገኝ ደስታ እንደሚሆን ነው። የጠፋ ነገር ሲገኝ ደስ ይባላል። ሰው በግ እንኳን ጠፍቶበት ሲያገኝ ደስ ይላል ይላችኋል። and he again tells them another parable, and that parable is ወይም 10 የብር ሳንቲሞች ያላት ሴት ከ10ሩ አንዱ ቢጠፋባት እስክትኛው ድረስ መብራት አብርታ ቤቷን ጠርጋ አጥብቃ የማትፈልግ ሴት ማናት ይላል። ይህንስ 10 ብር ቢጠፋ ከዛ አንዱን ብር ከ10 ብር 1 ብር ቢጠፋት መብራት አበርታ አልጋ ስር እየገባች ከፍ ዝቅ እያለች ያን 1 ብር ታገኛለች። ከዛ ስታገኘው ምን ይላል? አሁንም እሷም ወዳጅ ጎረቤቶቿን በአንድነት ጠራና የጠፋብኝን የብር ሳንቲም አግኝቻለሁና ከኔ ጋር ደስ ይበላችሁ ትላለች ይላል። አሁንም የጠፋ ስለተገኘ እኮ ደስ አላት ይላል። አሁንም ደግሞ እንደዚህም ንስሐ በሚገባ በአንድ ኃጢአተኛ በእግዚአብሔር መላእክት ፊት ደስታ ይሆናል ይላቸዋል። ከዛ አሁንም ሌላ ምሳሌ ይነግራቸዋል። የጠፋው ልጅ ምሳሌ የምንለውን እኛ የምናውቀው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ አንድ ሰው 2 ልጆች ነበሩት ይለናል። ከዛ በኋላ አንዱ ልጅ ድርሻዬን ስጠኝ ብሎ ድርሻውን ይዞ ሄዶ እንደጠፋ በራሱ ፍቃድ እንደጠፋ ይነግረናል። ከዛ ግን እንደተሰቃየ ያለውን ነገር እንደጨረሰ ይነግረናል። ከዛ በኋላ ብዙ ከተሰቃየ በኋላ ወደ አባቱ ቤት ብመለስ ይሻላል እንዳለ፣ ከዛ በኋላ ወደ አባቱ ቤት እንደተመለሰ አባቱ ሲያየው ደስ እንዳለው again the theme of rejoicing comes back, right? አባቱ የጠፋውን ልጅ ስላገኝ ደስ አለው። በጣም ከዛ በኋላ ራራለት፣ ተቀበለው፣ ድግስ ደገሰለት፣ ጎረቤቶቹን ጠራ። ልክ እነዛ ሰዎች ጎረቤቶቻቸውን ጠሩ የጠፋው ስለተገኘ ብሎ እንደነገረን in the previous 2 parables እዚህም ጋር እንደዚሁ እንደሆነ እናያለን። ከዛ እንደሸለመው እንዳለበሰው። ከዛ በኋላ ግን ታላቅ ልጅ ወንድምየው እርሻ ቦታ ነበር። ሲመጣ ደስታ ይሰማል። ምንድነው ሲል የጠፋው ልጅ ተገኘ። ከዛ በኋላ ግን እንደከፋው እናያለን። ይሄ ልጅ እንደከፋው ታላቅ ወንድሙ ተቆጣ ይለናል። ስለዚህ ልክ እነዛ ፈሪሳውያን አጉረመረሙ ብሎ እንደጀመረን ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ የጠፋ ስለተገኘ የሚያጉረመረም ልጅ እናገኛለን እዚህ ጋር። እንዴ እነሆ ይሄን ያህል ዘመን እኮ ባሪያ ሆኜ አገልግዬሃለሁ፣ ለእኔ እንዲህ ያድርገልኝ አታውቅም ብሎ እንደከፋው ይነግረናል። ከዛ አባቱ መጨረሻ ላይ ምን ይለዋል? ልጄ ሆይ አንተ ሁልጊዜ ከኔ ጋር ነህ፣ የኔ የሆነ ሁሉ ያንተ ነው። ይህ ወንድምህ ግን ሞቶ ነበር፣ ሕያው ሆነ፣ ጠፍቶ ነበር፣ ተገኘ። ስለዚህ ደስ ሊለንና ፍስሐ ልናደርግናል ብሎ ይጨርሳል። ዩሲ ይሄ ምሳሌ እንዲነገር ያደረገው ማጉረምረም ነው፣ ደስ አለመሰኘት ነው። ኃጢአተኞች ጋር ኢየሱስ ስለዋለ። ከዛ በኋላ የመጨረሻው የምሳሌው ፒክም ላይ የሚነገረን ይሄ ነው። የጠፋ ነገር ሲገኝ ደስ ሊለን ነው የሚገባው ነው ማለት ነው። ዘ ሜን ሜሴጅ ኢትስ አን አንሰር ቱ ዘ መርመሪንግ ኦፍ ዘ ፋሪሲስ ማለት ነው። ዘ መርመርድ ሂንስ ኢን ፓራብል ሂ ኢዝ ቴሊንግ ዘም ኢፍ ዩ አር ራይት ኢን ዘ ማይንድ ኢፍ ዩ አር ኮሬክት ዩ ሹድ ሃቭ ቢን ሃፒ ቢኮዝ እነዚህ ኃጢአተኞች ጠፍተው ነበር፣ ተገኝተዋል። ኃጢአተኛ የጠፋ ሲገኝ ዘ አፕሮፕሪየት ሪስፖንስ ኢዝ ጆይ ኢትስ ሪጆይሲንግ እያለ ነው ማለት ነው። ሂንስ when we read the parable of the prodigal son, it's quite okay to talk about, for example, the intensity of the love of the father or the intensity of the sin of the prodigal son and all that. But we should remember the climax of the story or the main message of the story is the need to rejoice. It's about rejoicing. Whenever a lost thing is found, the appropriate response is rejoicing የሚለው ነው ዋና መልእክት ማለት ነው። Hence, you should ask, why is this parable being told? What is the main reason that this parable is being told? And the message of the parable that you extract out of the parable should answer the question it's trying to answer ማለት ነው። Hence, it's quite okay to talk about, for example, the love of God or things like that. You should remember that that's the main message. The main message that's communicated is rejoice whenever a lost person is found, because even a person who loses his ship rejoices when he finds it, and even a person who loses one coin rejoices when she finds it. And the same is true when a person loses his son and he finds it, he rejoices. So you shouldn't be like the bigger brother. You should rejoice እያላቸው ነው ማለት ነው የሚያጉረመርሙትን ሰዎች። So you should ask these questions whenever dealing with parables ማለት ነው። Is that clear? Is that clear? Good.
Yes.
Good. Any question before we finish? Okay. Again, I encourage you to submit your assignments. You have an assignment due next week. It's going to be on acts on narrative, so you should do that. Since we've already talked about the Gospels, you should be able to deal with acts as well. So I expect your assignment till then, and I also allow you to send a specific lab report about wisdom for this as well. So you use it means you have two specific assignments due ማለት ነው, the one on wisdom literature and the one or assignment 3 and assignment 4 ማለት ነው. So do that. Again, I do want to apologize for being late. As I've said, I forgot that it actually starts on 11:15. So missing last week kind of messed up my memory, so I apologize for that. If there is no question, see you next week. Aser, I didn't get some books of reading. Look, which books are you talking about, Aser? You have emailed? Okay, I will see the email. Okay. Okay. Any other question? Okay. See you next week, beloveds.